Right, so that's with regards to the Tikkunei Soferim, which is simply one of the many layers of textual corruption. Then I want to touch on another concept, which is one of the concepts that Brother Ali also mentioned, which is, or which pertains, I should say, to the paratextual elements. Now, one of these paratextual elements is actually the inverted nun, or also called the inverted nunim. In Hebrew, it's called the nun hafucha, which is the inverted nun, or also the nun menuzeret, which is isolated nun. So I want to read something from Dr. Emmanuel Tov on page 45 in his famous work, The Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, the 4th edition. He says, with regards to the inverted nunim, the so-called inverted nunim, or the nun letters, found in manuscripts and printed editions before and after Numbers chapter 10, verses 35 and 36, are misunderstood scribal signs indicating the removal of segments that are inappropriate in the context according to a scribe. These signs derive from the Greek letter sigma and its reversed form, the anti-sigma or anti-sigma, known from the Alexandrian scribal tradition and the Qumran scrolls as parenthesis signs. The inverted nunim represented the closest forms to the unknown sigma and anti-sigma, and in Numbers chapter 10, verses 35 and 36, the inverted nunim indicate that these verses, i.e. the song of the ark, did not appear in their correct place, as is also pointed out by a tradition in Avot Ravi Natan 34. The original scribal signs were meant as a remark and were not intended to be transferred into the next copy, but they were sanctified together with the text. Now, it is also mentioned in the Shabbat and the Babylonian Talmud, and the Shabbat 115b and 116a, the following. This is what the rabbis say. And the Holy One, blessed be He, made signs in the Torah for this portion, and it refers to Numbers chapter 10, verses 35 and 36. So the Holy One, blessed be He, made signs in the Torah for this portion above and below, i.e. before and after it, in order to say that this is not in its proper place, as the previous portion does not discuss the nation's travels. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi says, and note, this is another interpretation with regards to the inverted nunim. He says, it is not for that reason that signs were inserted. Rather, the signs are there because this portion is considered a book unto itself. Then it goes on, 116a. The Gemara asks, according to whose opinion is that which Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman said that Rabbi Yonatan said, that with regards to the verse, with wisdom she built her house, she carved its 7 pillars, which is a reference to Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1. So this rabbi is going to argue that Numbers chapter 10, verse 35 and 36 are actually a book unto itself. And this rabbi bases it upon a particular interpretation over Proverbs chapter 9, verse 1. He mentions the following. These are the 7 books of the Torah. According to whose opinion? He asks. Well, it is according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, as by his count, there are actually 7 books of the Torah, not 5, so not the Pentateuch. According to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, there are actually 7 books of the Torah. They are namely Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers chapter 1, verse 1 until chapter 10, verse 35. Then Numbers chapter 10, verse 35 and 36 are considered a book unto itself. And then the rest of Numbers, which is book number 6. And then the last one is actually the remainder of Deuteronomy, meaning the last book of what we consider nowadays the 5th book, right? So according to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, there are actually 7 books. I'm going to mention it again because it sounds confusing at first. So the books are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, chapter 1, starting from chapter 1, verse 1, until Numbers chapter 10, verse 35. So that's book number 4. And book number 5 are actually the two verses, namely verse 35 and 36 in Numbers chapter 10. That's book 5. Then book 6 is basically the remainder of Numbers. And then the last book is Deuteronomy. So 7 books in total. According to Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, according to him, this was also the reason why the inverted Nunim were placed here. It is also mentioned in another place called the Sifrei Bamidbar. With regards to these specific signs, there are marks bracketing it before and after in order to show that it is not in its proper place. So the Sifrei Bamidbar actually disagrees with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. So according to the Sifrei Bamidbar, these signs were actually brought about onto the text to show that these specific verses are actually not in their proper place. Right? So then it goes on. It says, the rabbi says, in order to show that it is itself a book, then it mentions the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, again, which I mentioned just now, that he considered the Torah as consisting of 7 books as opposed to 5 books. But then it also mentioned, for example, another rabbi who's called Rabbi Shimon, another rabbi, another authority. He says, these are marks before and after because this is not in its place. Rabbi Rashi, again, you could say that he's considered the Ibn Kathir within Rabbinical or Orthodox Judaism. He says with regards to the inverted nuns, he says, he made for it dividing marks, i.e. the inverted nuns, in front and behind it, in order to indicate that this is not its proper place. It would be more fittingly found in the place, in the section dealing with the march of the people in chapters 2 after verse 17. But why then? This is the question that Rashi asks. But why then is it written here? Well, in order, according to him, in order to make a break between the narrative of one punishment and that of another punishment, etc., as is stated in the Talmudic chapter concerning, and then he goes on to mention another verse in Numbers 11, and then he also mentions the reference, the Babylonian Talmudic reference, the Shabbat 115b, which I read, which says that the Holy One, which is God, i.e. God, he made signs in the Torah for this portion before and after it in order to say that this is not its proper place. Right? Another rabbi, the Ramban, which is the famous rabbi Nachmanides, not to be confused with Maimonides. This is another rabbi. Maimonides is called the Rambam with an M, but this rabbi Nachmanides is called the Ramban with an N. He mentions with regards to Numbers chapter 10 verse 35, Scripture make a sign for it before and after it in order to indicate that this is not its proper place. That this is not its proper place. So the majority of the rabbis actually agree that these specific signs, the inverted nunim, were brought about onto the text to show that these two verses in Numbers chapter 10, verse 35 and 36, these two particular verses are actually not in their proper place. So, as you can see, generally speaking, the rabbis held the opinion that this specific sign was to show that these specific verses are not in their proper place. Now, some hold it to mean that these two verses were actually considered or should be considered as their own book. You can find this in the Shabbat 116a, as well as the Tractate Soferim 6.1, which says, because it is a book on its own, And others, then it mentions the opinion of the other rabbis, others maintain that its proper place is in the section of the setting forward of the standards, which is another chapter in Numbers. So to basically simplify it, let's say, for example, that if I were to read Surah Al-Fatiha, which consists of 7 verses, let's say, for example, verse 4, which says Malik Yawmiddin or Malik Yawmiddin, depending upon the qira'ah, obviously. Let's say, for example, that I were to take this particular verse and then claim, you know what, actually, Malik Yawmiddin or Malik Yawmiddin should not be written here. This is wrong. It's not in its proper place. It should actually be put into Surah Al-Baqarah. What would you say to me, Ahmed, if I were to claim such a thing? What would you say to me?
Laugh at you.
Exactly. I mean, this is absurd. This is ridiculous. Because again, let me remind that Moses, apparently, supposedly, is the author of these specific verses. Supposedly, according to the Christian perspective or worldview or theology, as well as the Jewish theology, Moses knowingly and willingly, under divine inspiration, wrote these specific verses in their specific, particular order, right, within the chapter. But then later on, rabbis apparently disagreed with this, and they brought about the text certain signs to indicate that these 2 verses are actually not in their proper place and should actually be written in Numbers 11 or Numbers 2. I mean, could you imagine? This in of itself is problematic, by the way. Again, I want to ask the question to Christians. Do you believe that the rabbis who say such a thing, that these signs were knowingly and willingly, deliberately put into the text to indicate that these 2 verses are not in their proper place? Do you agree or do you disagree that the rabbis supposedly had any divine authority to do so, to do such a thing, and to claim such a thing? Do you believe so? And if yes, could you explain? If not, could you also explain why not? Now, there are also other verses where the inverted nun or the Nunim appear. Another place is in Psalms 107, verses 23 to 28, and verse 40. So verses 23 to 28 go as follows. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep, for he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to the heaven, they went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. This was Psalms 107, verses 23 to 28. But there is also an inverted nun that appears in verse 40, or after verse 40, which says the following. He pours contempt on princes and makes them wander in trackless wastes. Now, if you actually take a look at what the rabbis have to say with regards to this, such as Rashi, he says in his commentary, there are markers in this chapter, i.e., 6 inverted nuns. 6 inverted nuns, which are written, and they come to be expounded upon instead of buts and onlys to limit the power of the verse, meaning that if they, i.e. the prisoners, cry out before the verdict has been promulgated, they are answered. But after the verdict has been promulgated, they are not answered. So according to Rashi, there are 6, not even 7, by the way. He counts 6 inverted nuns present within this chapter. According to Rashi, their purpose is to show that if the prisoners cry out to God before their verdict has been announced or proclaimed, then they are answered. And if they cry out after the verdict has been answered or proclaimed, they are not to be answered. Now, it doesn't take much to realize that there is literally no need to put the inverted nuns here, since the verses are more than self-explanatory and apparent to show this. Also, another huge problem is that there, as far as I know, and I've looked at multiple sources, multiple midrashim, multiple commentaries of I don't know, almost 20 rabbis on, for example, Sefaria or Chabad or even other Jewish websites, even in the Hebrew. I could not find anything else within the Jewish literature concerning why there are all these inverted nuns here in Psalms 107, verse 23 to 28, as well as verse 40. I could find nothing else within Jewish literature concerning why there are all these inverted nuns here. I don't know, perhaps maybe Ali, I don't know if you found something with regards to this.
Only about numbers, Akhi, you are right. About
Yeah,
Psalms,
only
I
about
haven't found
numbers.
nothing.
Yeah. Outside of Rashi's commentary, I've found nothing else. Even in the Hebrew, I've looked at the Hebrew of multiple commentaries. I couldn't find anything else. They don't explain why there are these inverted nuns here, outside that they just simply show that apparently these verses are not in their proper places. But other than that, doesn't explain why they're here. So, in
Quran is,
short,
by the way, يحرفون الكلمة.
Exactly. يحرفون الكلمة, exactly, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 13 and 14. Exactly. Where it mentions that the Jews or the children of Israel changed or altered or corrupted the words, right? That they changed the words from their places or also corrupted their meanings or added some things, deleted some things, or omitted some things. There are multiple layers of corruption. There is also another concept, and Ali knows about this, but for simplicity's sake and also for time's sake, and I don't want to make this too long-winded because there's a lot, I know, and I realize that this is a lot of information. A lot of it sounds confusing at first, but inshallah, if in time, perhaps maybe another life or maybe multiple lives, we're going to expound on this even more, what these things or concepts are and how these concepts result into multiple theological problems, as well as an attestation to textual corruption, not just interpretive corruption, but also textual corruption, i.e. tahrif al-nas.